Okay, so let's unpack this. We've been handed a truly explosive and, I mean, a highly detailed set of source materials today. And they sit right at this really volatile intersection of international human rights, aggressive American cultural criticism, and very, very personalized celebrity politics.
And that's the thing you have to understand right from the start. This is not a balanced, neutral report we're looking
Not
at.
at all.
It is an organized, I'd even say comprehensive attack on what the source material sees as the moral and ideological corruption of cultural elites.
Right. So our mission for this deep dive isn't to validate any of these claims,
No.
but to really impartially analyze the argument itself. Because the sources are centered on this one relentless critique, this idea of perceived hypocrisy and selective outrage from high-profile Western figures.
Particularly Hollywood. The sources claim these voices, who, routinely champion certain social justice causes, are applying an incredibly strict and what they allege is a biased and even racially motivated filter.
A filter to decide which global injustices they talk about.
Exactly. Which ones they champion publicly and which ones they just conveniently ignore.
And the anchor point for this whole argument, the central tragedy that the source uses as its ultimate litmus test for this alleged moral failure, it's a devastating international event.
It is. We have to start there with the core data point that sets this whole thing up.
The source just hammers Hollywood's deafening silence on the reported massive massacre of more than 20,000 Iranians by their own government.
Right. And for the source, this event is the definitive failure. The logic is, if a mass slaughter on that scale doesn't qualify for celebrity outrage, then what possibly could?
It's framed not just as a tragedy, but as a deliberate choice, a deliberate omission.
Absolutely. So to really understand the rhetorical weight here, we need to dissect the specific crises mentioned. You've got Iran, Venezuela, Nigeria, and then look at how the source uses these really specific legal and personal attacks against one person, Mark Ruffalo.
And they use him to define this broader alleged, well, they call it the devil's agenda at play.
Yeah. So we're diving into the argument, the evidence they present, and the extremely aggressive terminology they use to make their case.
Okay, so let's establish the setting, the foundation of this entire critique. The source lays out a situation in Iran that is, I mean, by their telling, just horrific and deeply.
It is. They stated very clearly, in the span of just 2 weeks, a staggering number, over 20,000 Iranians have allegedly been massacred.
In their own streets. And the source is very insistent that these are not militants, they're not political actors.
No, they're described as people simply fighting for their own rights.
Yeah.
And that's the foundational claim right there.
Yeah.
A mass atrocity that is being, in their view, ignored by the very people who claim to care most about human rights.
And the language they use to describe the regime responsible is, well, it's unsparing.
Oh, it's almost apocalyptic. It frames the Iranian government not just as, repressive, which many international bodies would agree with,
Right.
but specifically as a fascistic, jihadist dictatorship. They even use the word evil.
That's a very deliberate vocabulary choice. It's not political disagreement.
No, it immediately places the regime outside the realm of legitimate politics and into this space of, absolute moral darkness. And on the other side, you have the protests, who are framed purely as innocent Iranians.
Innocent Iranians just trying to use their voice.
Yeah, to stand up for the right thing, which is defined as, seeking the kind of social liberties and personal freedoms that people in a democracy or a republic like the U.S. tend to enjoy.
So the source isn't just reporting on a crisis, it's setting up this perfect binary oppression versus innocence, evil versus freedom.
Exactly. And then who's in charge?
This is what we need to spend some time. Why does the source find Hollywood's silence so surprising or even malicious, especially with a number like 20,000 plus being cited?
Well, the source argues that this event is, ironically, the perfect script for the very group they're targeting.
The perfect script.
Yeah, they use this really charged pejorative language, calling them the woke folk on the left and their overlords in Hollywood.
So their argument is entirely framed around identity politics.
Entirely. It's based on a presumed historical script that they believe the cultural elite always followed. They stress the point. Brown people are being subjugated, marginalized, oppressed, and now massacred en masse.
By their own government.
Right. So to the source, these specific circumstances, mass oppression, slaughter involving a minority group, this should be the ultimate cause they rally behind, based on Hollywood's past behavior.
Their past activism and, as the source calls it, Virtue signaling.
Exactly. The critique is saying their own established pattern demands outrage right now.
In the absence of that outrage, the complete silence on a claim of 20,000 deaths, it doesn't imply ignorance or that they just missed it.
No, according to the source, it implies a profound, active moral failure. This is where the rhetoric gets really, really aggressive.
How so?
The source takes this silence to an extreme conclusion. They suggest it means these cultural elites are, in effect, choosing a side.
Choosing the side of the oppressors.
They claim the silence means Hollywood is on the side of not just the Maduros of the world.
Maduros, that's a very specific term.
It's a derogatory term they use for narco-dictators like Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. They're saying Hollywood is on their side and also on the side of the jihadist dictators in Iran.
So by choosing to be silent, the source is arguing they implicitly endorse the actions.
Precisely. It places them morally and politically on the side of evil and dark. And that, in the source's view, makes them wrong on every single issue they claim to champion.
It's a foundational rhetorical move, isn't it? Turning their silence into an active, malicious choice.
It is. And I think we need to linger on that, on the function of that charge link. When they use terms like Maduros or wokety, woke folk, they're signaling to a very specific audience.
Creating an in-group, out-group dynamic.
Absolutely. It's not just criticism. It's cultural warfare embedded in the very words they choose.
Wokety woke folk is an immediate.
It's a way to dismiss political positions as shallow or performative without actually engaging. And by using Maduros, they link the Iranian theocracy to a South American authoritarian model, suggesting this sort of global conspiracy of dictatorship that Hollywood is quietly supporting.
It's an attempt to unify these different political foes under one big umbrella of moral content.
You've got it. And this alleged corruption and detachment, it all ties back to the source's general description of who these figures even are.
Right, the ivory tower, the idea that they're fundamentally out of touch with reality and ordinary.
Exactly. The source spends a lot of time establishing the moral unfitness of its targets. Hollywood figures are described as being the most pretentious human beings on the planet.
And they acknowledge that, all people are flawed.
They do, but they say these figures specifically live in an ivory tower, physically and emotionally isolated from normal life, and they're constantly looking down on the rest of the world.
And their mission, according to this critique, is to use their platforms to teach us about how to view life.
To impose their moral framework on society. But, and this is the core of the attack on their character, the source claims they are uniquely unfit for this role.
Because their private lives are allegedly far more scandalous than the lives of the people they're preaching.
That's the heart of the personal character assassination. The source argues that these elites have some of the most issues per capita imaginable.
And they list a whole catalog of alleged private sins.
They do. Addictions, obsessions, and proclivities that would land most people in prison. That's a direct quote.
Wow. Land most people in prison. That's not a small claim.
Not at all. It's a crucial rhetorical move designed to strip them of any moral high ground. They don't detail what these proclivities are, but that single phrase implies high-level criminality, moral decay, or just extreme deviancy.
So the source uses this extreme, unsubstantiated claim about their private life to argue that their moral immunity is entirely bought, paid for, not earned.
Correct. The only reason they avoid the consequences that, regular people would face for similar behavior is because of their status, their notoriety, and their money.
This insulation, this bubble of wealth,
is what allows them to ignore real injustice, like the alleged 20,000 deaths in Iran, while at the same time being very loud and dictatorial about what you, the public, should care.
It's a foundational attack on their moral authority. The idea that their wealth acts as a shield, letting them live outside the ethical boundaries they want to enforce.
And it's an interesting strategy, right? It uses the source's perception of celebrity decadence to invalidate their public political stance on global affairs.
It attempts to discredit the messenger, to delegitimize the message itself, whatever that.
Exactly. The source is saying, you who are so morally flawed and private, whose wealth protects you from any consequences, you cannot possibly be a genuine judge of global suffering or human rights.
And their silence on the biggest reported tragedy of the moment, Iran, is the final piece of evidence.
The final proof that their activism is just a performance dictated by corporate or ideological interest and not genuine compassion. And that transition takes us from this general critique of Hollywood to the intensely focused, personal, and legally fraught case study of one actor.
And this is where the critique gets incredibly. It moves from the general concept of the ivory tower to single out one person for a highly detailed and, frankly, scathing attack, the actor Mark Ruffalo.
And right away, the source establishes this highly pejorative frame. They label him TDS Patient 1.
TDS Patient 1.
And refer to him dismissively as a has-been washed-out former Hulk.
So the source is really using Ruffalo as the ultimate case study to demonstrate the hypocrisy they're trying.
He's the poster boy for it. war, and we need to analyze that specific language. TDS patient 1 is critical.
It's a specific political label, Trump derangement syndrome patient.
Right, and by using it, the source dismisses Ruffalo's political engagement not as a difference of opinion, but as a severe politically induced mental illness.
So it immediately frames everything he says as irrational and baseless.
Exactly. It prepares the audience to just accept the subsequent claims that he's a liar and he's spreading misinformation.
And the source tries to back this up, right? By bringing up several of his public statements on foreign policy and domestic politics?
They do. The critique focuses on his commentary about U.S. foreign policy. The source claims he lied about a vice president lying. He lied about what the source calls an illegal invasion and war with Venezuela, and just a general disregard for international law.
So the source's perspective is that his commentary is just pure ideological bias.
Yeah, they say he's operating on blue sky, judging based on his own morality and progressive worldview rather than on, verifiable facts or established international law.
The claim is that he's substituting emotion and politics for objective.
Let's dig into that Venezuela claim for a second, because the source comes back to it later.
Yeah.
What's the counter-narrative they provide to show Ruffalo was supposedly lying about an illegal war?
Well, the source alleges that Ruffalo's framing of the Venezuelan crisis, probably about U.S. sanctions or involvement, was fundamentally wrong.
Right.
And their counter-argument hangs on this claim that the people of Venezuela are the ones celebrating against Ruffalo's anti-intervention.
So it's a very specific political point. They're suggesting that the population most affected, the Venezuelan, actually wanted the pressure being put on the Maduro regime.
And therefore, Ruffalo, by arguing against those measures, was speaking against the very people he claimed to be championing, which in their eyes makes him factually unreliable.
And that leads us to the most damaging and legally loaded accusation in the whole source material. This is where the critique turns into a full-on financial threat.
He is explicitly quoted by the source as making these highly inflammatory and potentially defamatory remarks about a major political.
That's the pivot point. The source states, with a lot of confidence, that Ruffalo explicitly called a political figure a convicted felon or convicted rapist and the worst human being.
And we have to note the severity of those unverified claims.
Oh, absolutely. That level of personal, legally sensitive attack, especially using terms that imply a criminal conviction, is what triggers the source's immediate warning about a massive defamation suit waiting to happen.
The source believes he has opened himself up to catastrophic personal liability.
They do. And this is where the analysis gets really interesting and specific, because they don't just issue a vague threat. They immediately back it up with a very powerful, high-profile, and very expensive legal precedent.
This is the $16 million defamation suit context.
Absolutely. This is the rhetorical masterstroke of the source material. It references a major $16 million lawsuit settlement that was won by a former president against Disney.
Specifically against its subsidiary, ABC News.
Right. And this event is placed roughly a year prior to the video's context, which the source dates around 2026. Bringing this up has a twofold purpose.
Okay.
First, to establish that this political figure will sue and will win huge judgment. And second, to financially threaten the parent corporation, Disney, which is Ruffalo's main employer.
Let's talk about the mechanics of that $16 million payout, because the source really emphasizes that the liability was triggered by an incredibly small comment.
They hammer home this extreme cost-to-comment ratio. They detail that Disney had to fork out $16 million because of only 2 words said on air by George Stephanopoulos.
Just 2 words.
2 words. And the source emphasizes they were the trigger. Convicted apopist.
Convicted apopist. So a slightly garbled or quickly said phrase implying convicted rapist.
Exactly. And that was enough to cause a multi-billion-dollar corporation $16 million.
So the source is drawing a very explicit, very high-stakes parallel between Disney's past liability and Ruffalo's current behavior.
They are. The source is essentially issuing a calculated financial warning.
What's the consequence for Ruffalo supposed to be then, given his alleged remarks were more expansive?
Well, the implied answer is a massive lawsuit that could bankrupt Ruffalo personally, or at least create an enormous new liability for Disney, who'd likely be implicated through their employee.
So they're using this legal precedent as a very powerful, very specific threat.
They're saying you are vulnerable and your employer has a history of paying out massive sums for this exact type of mistake.
This elevates the critique way beyond political disagreement. It becomes a high-stakes professional and legal challenge.
It does. And the source immediately tackles the idea of Ruffalo's personal immunity by scrutinizing his wealth in the financial and security scrutiny segment.
They pivot right to his money to dismiss his credibility about feeling fear or hardship.
They do. They provide his estimated net worth, and they detail a huge range. The low end is around $35 million, but some high-end 2025 estimates go up to $9 million.
And the argument is that a person with that much money is just fundamentally insulated from the concerned fears of regular people.
Money is an impenetrable barrier. That's the idea.
And they use a very specific politically charged example to illustrate this in the involvement of ICE, U.S. immigration, and customs.
The choice of ICE is highly strategic. The source dismisses the idea that Ruffalo is genuinely terrified of the political climate. They ask rhetorically if he's ever going to be anywhere near a place where an ICE agent would be doing their job.
So they're dismissing the idea he could live in genuine terror.
Right. His multi-million-dollar life, the source suggests, is just incompatible with experiencing real political fear or the threat of law enforcement intrusion.
And the source adds a cynical little caveat to that observation.
The very cynical one. The critique suggests that the only way Ruffalo would ever encounter that kind of law enforcement action is, and I quote, unless ICE is coming for somebody within his own household.
That's a veiled, aggressive insinuation.
Oh, it is. Yeah. They suggest any encounter with federal authorities wouldn't be random, but a targeted action, maybe related to his own alleged proclivities or people connected to him. It's a final dramatic attempt to paint the celebrity's expressed fears as fundamentally disconnected and privileged.
So the overall point is that the source paints Mark Ruffalo as a figure using his huge platform to make these highly controversial, legally actionable statements,
while at the same time selectively ignoring a massive human rights crisis, the 20,000 deaths in Iran, which the source believes should perfectly align with his supposed ideal.
And the consequence, they claim, is a massive potential lawsuit that Disney has already proved they're vulnerable to.
And this selective silence, according to the source, it's not random. It points to a broader ideological, maybe even a religious mandate that governs Hollywood's choices.
The idea is that the criteria for activism aren't humanitarian, they're ideological.
That's it. And we need to expand the critique now, beyond just Iran, to cover other alleged blind spots, specifically the violence facing Christians in Nigeria.
Right. The source explicitly notes this pattern of ignoring Christian populations who are persecution.
And this is used as more crucial evidence that Hollywood's activism is run by this arbitrary and discriminatory filter.
The logic being, if they only seem to care when the victims are not Christians, there must be an underlying religious bias.
That is precisely the connection the source is forcing you to make. They're looking for the common denominator in the crises that are...
So in Iran, you have Muslim protesters seeking freedom from a theocracy, but the perpetrators are Islam. In Nigeria, the victims are Christians targeted by jihadists.
And the source provides this single overarching explanation for why these two specific cases are ignored by the cultural elite. It links the political silence to a deeper, fundamental religious critique,
arguing that Hollywood is explicitly and intentional
Antichrist.
That is extremely strong link. When the source says Antichrist, what do they mean? Is that just a synonym for secular, or is it something much more?
The source absolutely means the latter intentional antagonism. The critique claims Hollywood operates directly in opposition to Christ.
Not just a lack of faith, but a hostile institutional worldview.
Yes, a worldview that dictates their response to global suffering. Because the Iranian regime is defined as jihadist and the Nigerian perpetrators are targeting Christians, the source argues that Hollywood, being antichrist, inherently aligns against the victim and with the ideological framework of the aggressors.
So they're framing the entire cultural output of Hollywood as ideological warfare against Christian principles. Do they offer a specific cultural example to back this up, this idea of mocking Christ?
They offer a very current and specific one that they believe confirms this pattern of hostility.
Okay.
The source cites the recent casting of the bald chick from Wicked.
A reference to the pop star Ariana Grande.
Right, who they then identify as Grande's alleged overlord in a Jesus Christ Superstar rendition. This is held up as a specific example of this derogatory mocking.
Okay, let's unpack that. Why is that casting choice? What's the logic?
The source's interpretation is very specific. First, they refer to the star as being under the influence of an overlord, which suggests a nefarious controlling element to her career.
Okay.
Second, casting a high-profile, secular, and arguably controversial pop figure in a role central to a sacred narrative that's interpreted by the source not as artistic license, but as a deliberate attempt to defile or ridicule the religious figure.
So this performance, in their eyes, becomes Exhibit A in the argument that Hollywood has this hostile and mocking stance toward Christianity.
Exactly. And this established hostility, according to the source, is then linked directly back to the geopolitical selective outrage we were talking about before. It creates a seamless ideological narrative.
How so?
The source suggests that because Hollywood has already shown they are technically down with the jihad when it's trendy enough, And here they cite the broad reference to Free Palestine. It naturally follows that they wouldn't care about Christians being slaughtered by jihadists.
That's a deeply cynical argument.
It is. By supporting one side of a conflict when it fits a current trend, the source says this trend inherently prevents them from caring about a group like Nigerian Christian, who the source sees as ideologically opposed to the Hollywood worldview.
So it's a claim that ideological consistency, however the source defines it, trumps any humanitarian.
Precisely. So, if they're not motivated by true morality or religious conviction, but by this anti-Christ agenda, what's the cynical corporate motivation driving figures like Ruffalo?
And that gets us into the idea of the corporate mandate, the allegation that activism is part of the job.
The source presents a completely transactional view of celebrity political action. They argue these celebrities aren't individuals exercising free speech, they are employees executing a job description.
Ruffalo, for example, is accused of just doing what he's paid to do by whom he is paid to do it.
A direct reference back to his employer, which the source previously identified as Disney. The source suggests that all the controversial political statements, the alleged lies, the strategic silences, they're all products of a corporate or ideological mandate, not personal belief.
That interpretation completely removes any genuine moral agency from the celebrity. The implication is that their political statements are essentially mandated from on high.
That is the ultimate conclusion, and it is framed in the most dramatic terms possible. Their action, whether it's political commentary or strategic silence, are described as serving the purpose of perpetuating the devil's agenda.
And devil's agenda isn't being used metaphorically here.
No, it's the source's explicit articulation of the ultimate goal of this anti-Christ worldview that Hollywood allegedly embodies. It suggests the celebrity is just an employee executing a strategic, malevolent agenda. It redefines their activism as corporate marketing, completely devoid of any real compassion for humanity.
It's a comprehensive argument. It's designed to delegitimize the entire cultural elite. Their private lives are corrupt, their wealth insulates them, their activism is selective, and their purpose is determined by this anti-religious, corporate, and even demonic agenda.
It's a fully integrated worldview. And that framework, the idea that the oppressor has to fit a certain identity profile for the activism to be legitimate, that takes us into the final, highly analytical section of the critique, all about the manipulation.
And this leads us to arguably the most complex and I think fascinating part of the critique.
Yep.
The source's analysis of how Hollywood selectively applies these politically charged labels.
Specifically, oppression and colonization.
Right. And the argument is that these labels are applied almost entirely based on the racial or cultural identity of the person doing the oppressing rather than the act itself.
And what's so interesting here is the critique's attempt to deconstruct the criteria for activism, which the source believes is based on this rigid racial framework.
So let's go back to the situation in Iran. As the source details, you have brown, a Persian majority, various ethnic minorities, subjugated under a fascistic 40...
Which, objectively fits many standard definitions of long-term oppression. Very narrative Hollywood might champion.
But the source identifies what they see as the key difference, the fatal flaw in the script culture.
And that's the identity of the oppressors themselves.
Exactly.
The core problem, according to this critique, is that the perpetrators in Iran are Islam. They're defined as other brown.
And this is seen as violating some unwritten rule in the Hollywood Act playbook.
A playbook which the source alleges is only concerned with oppression when the oppressor fits a specific historical template, which they define as a Western white male power structure.
So if the oppressor and the oppressed share a similar racial or geographical background, source claims Hollywood just loses interest because the narrative fit their requirements.
And this interpretation is linked directly to what the source calls the old slavery argument,
where racial identity is allegedly used to judge historical and contemporary injustices with a complete double.
Yes, the source is arguing that in the current cultural worldview propagated by the elite, oppression or historical atrocity is only considered a legitimate issue for public outcry when, quote, the white men.
But the moment brown people or black men are the perpetrators, whether in a historical context or a contemporary crisis.
The source claims the narrative shifts dramatically. The response is either then it never happened or at the very least it's not the same.
It's a scathing critique of what they see as a racially essentialist double standard applied to historical wrongdoing.
It suggests culpability is being assigned based on immutable characteristics rather than objective action.
And this linguistic critique of selective labeling goes even further when the source breaks down the subtle different terms relocate versus colon.
This is an argument about how history is categorized and sanitized based on who did the conquering. It raises a really important question about how history is taught and interpreted in modern cultural centers.
So the source argues that when non-white groups historically took areas of land by force and forced the people into their own customs and beliefs, otherwise they would slaughter them?
That this massive violence and territorial conquest is often not labeled or counted as colonization in the cultural dialogue favored by Hollywood.
So if colonization is reserved exclusively for a specific group of aggressor, what is this type of violence called when it's perpetrated by non-white groups, according to the source?
The source suggests it's often minimized or dismissed, framed simply as relocation because the aggressors were brown.
So the rhetorical goal is to demonstrate that the cultural elites are manipulating language to minimize historical atrocities committed by non-white groups.
And reserving the harsh, loaded, politically toxic term colonization exclusively for those committed by white actors. The source sees this linguistic gymnastics as fundamentally dishonest and ideologically motivated.
Okay, so the overall argument concludes that because Hollywood is preoccupied with these selective narratives, corporate mandates, and linguistic filters, they have basically forfeited their right to be genuine activists.
And therefore, the responsibility for genuine, impartial activism falls squarely on someone.
Which becomes the call to action for the audience, for us on the other side of the ivory tower.
That is the ultimate pivot, since the ones who have the massive platforms, meaning Hollywood and the celebrities we've talked about, will not stand up for what is right.
As evidenced by their silence on Iran.
The source argues it is the audience's moral and civic duty to take on that responsibility. It elevates you, the listener, from being a passive observer to an active moral agent.
And what does that action actually look like, specifically for the Iranian crisis, which is still the central, ignored tragedy?
The source details a two-pronged approach. First, a call to spiritual act, to pray for our brothers and sisters,
which establishes a moral framework rooted in faith, directly contrasting with the alleged antichrist agenda of.
Second, a political and civic act, to apply pressure on our own governments to do something and do the right thing.
The source argues that the audience has to act because the celebrities are only focused on perpetuating the devil's agenda of their employers.
And therefore cannot be relied upon to speak truth to power.
And the final reiteration of the Venezuela serves as the source's proof point for why the audience should trust their perspective and act rather than trusting the celebrity narrative.
It does. The critique of Ruffalo's comments on the war with Venezuela that we illegally invaded is brought back up as the definitive example of celebrity political failure.
The source concludes that on this issue, there is no two sides.
Because the evidence that the people of Venezuela are the ones celebrating, the actions Ruffalo spoke against, shows that the celebrity's perspective was not just factually wrong, but was driven by a political ideology that blinded him to the actual needs of the oppressed people.
Which makes him fundamentally unreliable.
And thus, the audience must assume his role. The critique ends with a very clear delineation. The celebrity is the ideological enemy. You, the audience, are the only remaining moral actor. So if we synthesize this, the core tension established in this really intense source material, it's a scathing and complex critique. It goes far beyond a simple disagreement over politics.
It does. The source paints a picture where this clash between perceived moral purity and cultural commentary and the selective application of outrage is just fundamentally compromised.
And the massive reported massacre of over 20,000 people in Iran is the ultimate test case for this hypocrisy. It's used to indict the entire moral credibility of Hollywood.
And our deep dive today focused not just on the events, Iran, Nigeria, Venezuela, but on the highly specific, detailed, and aggressive argument about media, money, and morality sources trying. The value here lies in understanding the complex web of connection. It links alleged celebrity misinformation and ideological blindness, that whole TDS patient one thing,
to the specific high-stakes precedent of the $16 million defamation lawsuit settlement against Disney for just 2 words.
And then it connects that to the extreme personal wealth and alleged moral failings of Ruffalo and the broader claims of religious and linguistic bias that govern their act.
It is an integrated, all-encompassing, and deeply cynical worldview. A critique that demands we look past the surface-level celebrity activism and consider the source's central claim,
which is that economic and professional dependence, especially to large corporations like Disney, or to a defined ideological agenda, what they call Antichrist, the devil's agenda, that this fundamentally compromises their ability to speak genuine power.
And their silence on these massive, geopolitically complex tragedies like Iran is, the source argues, the ultimate proof of this compromise.
And that leaves us with our final provocative thought for you to consider, based entirely on the detailed arguments we've analyzed today. If the people who shape the cultural narrative and influence global opinion are, as the source suggests, financially and professionally bound to their employer, be that a corporation or a perceived ideological master that pays their massive salary, can they ever truly possess independent moral authority to speak truth to power on politically sensitive global issues? Or are they always, simply and predictably, perpetuating a hidden agenda that benefits the structure it's a question that goes right to the heart of celebrity influence in a fractured and now legally accountable